This is Agriculture Today. I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. Ahead of us on this Thursday's program, we start with Sarah Lancaster. She's our K-State Weed Science Specialist, and she's joining us to discuss information regarding fall scouting, cleaning equipment, and the latest season of the War Against Weeds podcast. Also ahead, K-State field crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth advises against combining herbicides and pesticides when trading volunteer wheat this year. We end today's programming with K-State horticulturalist Ward Upham. He says that the warm, sunny days we enjoy during winter can be harmful for young, thin-barked trees. He discusses ways to protect those trees from Sunscald. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today for Samantha Bennett. I'm Ag Today intern Katie Figge. Joining me today in studio, we have K-State Weed Science Specialist Sarah Lancaster, and today she'll be speaking with us about fall scouting, cleaning equipment, and the latest from her podcast, We're on Weeds. So Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Katie. Thanks for inviting me over.
So we're kind of in a weird in-between season in a lot of ways right now in terms of preparing for the harvest of some crops and preparing for the planting of others. So at this point in the season, are weeds really a concern?
Katie, weeds are always a concern. I say that a little tongue-in-cheek because they're always important to me, but in all honesty, this is a really important time of year for thinking about weed management. In my role as an extension specialist, some of the questions I'm getting right now range from what burn-down herbicide should I use ahead of my wheat because I have pigweeds coming up in my wheat field, through what do I do with the pigweeds that are coming up after I shell my corn, right? So we're thinking about this from multiple perspectives.
So what kind of species of weed specifically should producers be concerned with?
So across the state of Kansas, the number one weed of interest is pigweed species. And so in the eastern kind of quarter of the state, that's water hemp. But as we move west, that gets to be Palmer amaranth, which is one of the worst weeds in most of the U.S. Those are the top two weed species really across the country.
So just for future reference, why do those species of weeds specifically tend to hang around?
Reasons why the pigweeds are a problem, specifically Palmer amaranth and water hemp, are numerous. You know, if we think about the biology of those weeds, one of the things that's unique about them is that they're what we call a dioecious plant, which means there's male plants and female plants. So female plants produce a seed. So the good news is that only about half of the population is producing seed. The bad news is that each of those female plants has the capacity to produce hundreds of thousands of seeds. So they're very prolific. The reason I mention them being dioecious is because that means there's lots of opportunities for gene flow back and forth among different plants. And so one of the reasons that's important is because these two weeds, Palmer amaranth and water hemp, have a lot of populations that are resistant to a lot of our major herbicides. So really, why are the pigweeds such a problem? It's because most of the populations that we encounter have some level of herbicide resistance or herbicide tolerance in them. So that's the number one reason, that and the seed production. One escape, has the potential to be a problem for years just because of the number of seeds that they produce.
So what are some of those control methods for those species that hang around?
If we're thinking about the pigweed species like Palmer amaranth and water hemp, we're relying on herbicides a lot for those weeds in terms of controlling them. We think a lot about, in the example of my farmer that was asking about herbicides ahead of wheat, we want to make sure we have something that has some residual activity, so something that's going to keep weeds from germinating in the future after we've killed everything that has emerged. That's one important strategy, is multiple herbicide modes of action and relying on residual herbicides or increasing our use of residual herbicides. But as we think about these weeds that have developed a lot of resistant populations, so the pigweeds, kochia falls into that category as well, as an important weed in the state of Kansas, we need to think about using non-chemical control methods. That could be everything from narrowing our row spacings in soybeans so that we get canopy faster, to thinking about how much residue we're leaving when we harvest our fall crops, to using cover crops in some parts of the state, to just maintaining our equipment, right? Humans are great transporters of weed seeds. I have a colleague who last spring, when it was muddy, saved the mud off of his boots and planted it in the greenhouse. That was eye-opening when he shared that on Twitter for a lot of folks when they saw how many weeds you can move around just with the mud on your shoes. So think about now multiplying that to tractor tires, field cultivators, even thinking about combines. I know we're here at harvest time, and I think we're going to talk here in a minute about harvest weed seed control.
Yeah, why is it so important to use those non-chemical forms of doing that kind of stuff?
We need herbicides for efficient weed management in our crops, but we have to make sure that we are being good stewards of the herbicide technologies that we have. That means cleaning up weed escapes when they happen, and sometimes that needs to be non-chemical. That also means preventing the spread of weeds, particularly weed populations that we know to be herbicide resistant, that will be more difficult to control in the future. So those non-chemical pieces are just extra help for the herbicides to make sure that we get to keep the herbicides as long as possible.
Yeah, and certainly staying environmentally friendly as well.
Absolutely.
As we move into harvest, what are some things farmers should consider doing in terms of weed management?
So harvest is what everyone has on the brain right now, right, Katie? So as we think about weed management practices at harvest, there's a couple of things that come into play. One of them is just using that time in the combine seed or driving the grain cart or whatever it may be to pay attention for where your weed escapes occurred in the field. Take notes of what weeds are there, and then, obviously you're a busy person when you're in one of those two seats, so making good notes is not going to be possible, but if you can just make a mental note to come back when you stop for a second and write it down, just so you know where to expect to maybe need to modify your weed management program for next year. Maybe you're going to need to increase herbicide rates or think about something a little bit different in terms of the actual herbicides you use. So just using that time in the combine seat to do a little bit of scouting, multitasking. The other thing that we think about then is trying to manage weed seed spread with the combines.
Yeah, and while you're sitting in that cab as well taking notes, you could also be listening to your podcast.
Hey, absolutely. I appreciate free shameless promotions, Katie. Thank you.
Absolutely. So because this time of year might be a slow period for some producers, might this be a good time to consider cleaning equipment, and what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, so this time of year when we think about cleaning equipment, we're really thinking about combines, right? And I know farmers will tell you when they're shelling corn or when they're cutting beans, they have a very specific window of opportunity, right? When that crop is ideal to be harvested, they want to get it out as soon as possible in the event that let's cross our fingers and get some rain this fall, right? We don't want the crop still standing in the field. So most farmers, when you ask them to slow down the combine, they give you, kind of side eye, right? They're not real happy about this suggestion. But it can be super important if you're going from a field that had poor weed control and or suspect herbicide resistance to take some time to make sure that you're not spreading those weeds around. And so, combine clean out can look like a lot of things. It can be a pretty intense, multiple hour process, or we can take some simple steps and just try to kind of knock off what's loose in terms of the chaff and the crop residue and the weed seeds that are coming along with that as we move from field to field. Other strategies that are, low cost, potentially high gain in terms of managing weed seeds at harvest would be thinking about your harvest order, right? If you have one field in particular that was just a weed control failure this summer, try to save that field for the end of your harvest list, right? So that way you can go blow your combine off before you put it away for the winter and be done with that, right? And not have to get it back out, not have to clean it to avoid spreading those weed seeds.
Yeah, absolutely. Great recommendations. Where can listeners find more information about these kind of topics?
So there's a few places out there where you can find information about things like combine clean out for weed control in the fall. One of them is the e-update that we just put out a couple of weeks ago. Another place would be, we just recorded an episode of the podcast about combine clean out, and we visited with Dan Smith, who works for the University of Wisconsin, about combine clean out. And they've actually done some research looking at where the weed seeds kind of hang out on the combine and where are some places we can focus. So if someone wants some more detailed information about that, they can sure go find the podcast and listen to that starting next week.
Awesome. The link to that agronomy e-update that we're kind of following today with that article can be found in the show's notes of today's program, which can be found on agtoday.net. And then, Sarah, if listeners are tuning in and hoping to find more information on weeds in general, I know your podcast, The War on Weeds, had just started its 4th season. Where can listeners find that, and what can they expect if they decide to tune in?
So, yeah, I have been recording the War Against Weeds podcast with my counterpart from North Dakota State, and previously a counterpart from Missouri, but She has changed some focus areas, and so we've added one of our counterparts from Ohio. So we cover a big swath of the north central region, but we record episodes on everything from harvest weed seed control to using cover crops for weed management to sprayer clean out. We've done a couple of episodes focusing in on particular weed species and kind of the biology and ecology of weeds. We try to talk about a lot of things that we think will be of interest to folks who have to deal with weeds as part of their job. So we post those podcasts in a number of places. They're on Spotify, they're on Apple iTunes, they're on the Google Podcast page, or we have a landing page for the podcast. And so if you just Google War Against Weeds and probably put in K-State or Sarah Lancaster so you don't get a bunch of the other kind of weeds in your search, you should be able to find it easily enough.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that plug for your podcast. I'm sure our listeners will be tuning in, and I know I will as well. But thank you so much for your time and coming in to discuss this topic. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation, Katie.
Once again, that was K-State Weed Science Specialist Sarah Lancaster speaking on fall weed scouting, properly cleaning equipment, and the War Against Weeds podcast. Before we cut to a quick break, still ahead on Agriculture Today, we have K-State field crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth advises against combining herbicides and pesticides when treating volunteer wheat and provides insight on how to best protect the upcoming planted wheat against pests. We'll round out today's programming with K-State horticulturist Ward Upham. He discusses ways to protect trees from Sunscald because the warm, sunny days we enjoyed during the winter can be harmful for young, thin-barked trees. Like I mentioned, we're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Jeff Whitworth. He is our K-State field crop entomologist, and today we're going to be talking about considerations for the upcoming wheat planting season, as well as tips for getting rid of volunteer wheat and avoiding pests. So, Jeff, thanks for joining us.
Hey, my pleasure. It's always my pleasure to come on.
You're kind. I appreciate that. We're always happy to have you in studio as well. So, obviously, we've got a busy season coming up. A lot of the state got drought to consider, volunteer wheat across the state that's really come up. What should we be considering right now?
The drought. You said it. Number one, if you could get out and make it rain all across the state consistently for a couple of weeks, that would really help. But since it doesn't seem that we've had a lot of luck doing that, we really need to consider getting rid of the volunteer. And I know we've been kind of harping on that for years, especially this year. For whatever reason, it seems to me like there are some really nice, lush patches of volunteer wheat around at least the north central part of the state. You wouldn't think so because of the drought, but drought doesn't seem to bother that at all. So we really need to get rid of that volunteer at least 2 weeks prior to planting our crop, or at least 2 weeks prior to that crop germinating. I know this year, if we don't get any rain, the time we plant before it germinates might be a considerable time span there. But at least 2 weeks, the volunteer needs to be dead prior to the domestic wheat germinating. Now, one of the ideas I've heard put forth from several different folks this year, because we had armyworm and fall armyworm infestations pretty widespread and pretty large throughout the state the last 2 years. One of the ideas some of the folks put forth is to add an insecticide at the same time they put out their Roundup or their herbicide to control the volunteer wheat, just to kill the worms, the caterpillars, the armyworms, fall armyworms, whatever's out in the field. Now, this year, 2022, we have not had the widespread large populations of armyworms, fall armyworms that we've had in the past 2 years. There are still some around, but nothing like we've seen in the last couple of years. So number one, we do not recommend you adding an insecticide with a herbicide at the time to control volunteer wheat. I know it saves an application cost, and that's what you're all thinking, and it does. There's no doubt about that. But stop to think about it. If you put out an insecticide now, you spray your herbicide, number one, if you do have armyworms or worms feeding in your volunteer, that's going to kill the volunteer, the herbicide is, that's probably going to just starve the worms because you're going to do away with their host. If it doesn't, a lot of times it will just initiate early pupation, so they'll quit feeding anyway. Since their host is gone, they won't feed, they won't crawl someplace else to look for another host. So that's number one. Number two, the reason not to put an insecticide in with your herbicide when you're trying to control your volunteer is if you do put some out there now, you spray it, that insecticide's only going to last 10 to 14 days. So you may kill what's out there, but there may be some eggs, there may be some pupae, or they may fly in from other fields into the planted crop once it starts germinating, and you're not going to have any residual activity in that field because that residual activity is only going to last 10 to 14 days. So number one, you sprayed your herbicide on the volunteer. It's killed all the volunteer, did a good job. That by itself will probably take care of the worms. You don't need an insecticide. Number two, it's the timing. If it does will kill the worms if you spray it and they're there, but it won't last until your wheat germinates. And number three, we cannot in good conscience recommend you spray unless your potential pest is at a vulnerable stage and as at a treatment threshold. So right now, I've been around a lot of different areas in the state. I've not seen a treatment threshold in a wheat field. So we really are trying to recommend against adding an insecticide to your herbicide at the time of controlling your volunteer wheat just because it's not needed. And the fourth thing is you'll kill all the beneficials. So if there are any beneficials in the field, and we do have some aphids come in later on, there won't be any lady beetles or green lacewings or any of these beneficial insects there to help control those. So we really are trying to discourage putting an insecticide in with your herbicide just to save application costs, because really it won't. Later on, I mean, if the armyworms or the fall armyworms come into your wheat after it germinates, you're still going to have to spray. So it's just not a good pest management practice right now to add an insecticide with a herbicide to try and control the volunteer. But it is a great idea to control the volunteer because that volunteer wheat is the green bridge that wheat curl mites use, that Hessian flies use, that many aphids use. Most of our pests, whether they're pathogens, diseases, and or insects or mites, utilize volunteer wheat between the time when the wheat was harvested in the spring until the germination occurs with the planting of the wheat in the fall. So get rid of that volunteer wheat. It will really help with Hessian flies. By the way, we do have a few Hessian fly problems around this year. Every year we have a few, and every year it seems like they're in a different location. By a few, I mean a 1 to 2% infestation level in wheat, and a lot of times we don't even notice it. But every once in a while, it'll rise up and we'll have a massive infestation, and it will cause some real problems going into the fall or going into the spring. So just beware. The later you plant, the better off you are for most of our insect pests and most of our plant diseases. Get rid of the volunteer at least 2 weeks prior to your crop germinating, and that will definitely help. The wheat curl mite is the problem or the vector that causes or transmits wheat streak mosaic. Wheat streak mosaic has also, for whatever reason, been on the rise a little more in the state in the last couple of years. We have found it all the way across the state, which is kind of surprising because we always used to just kind of consider it mainly a problem in about the western third of the state, but it's all the way across the state now. Not in epidemic portions, but still we're starting to pick it up. So the wheat curl mite is just a little tiny mite. It can't fly, it can't jump, it can't hop, it can barely crawl. So the way that is moved about a field is mainly by the wind. So if you get rid of the volunteer, there's nothing for the mite to feed on. It will die. You won't have any problems with wheat streak mosaic. Also, then the aphids. The aphids, they're coming in now. They come in from the south or they blow around from one field to another. The later you can plant, the less time there is for aphid feeding on wheat and for aphids to transmit barley yellow dwarf if they are infected with that particular disease also. So just remember, it is a great idea to get rid of the volunteer and also to plant as late as you possibly can. And I know you got to look for the moisture and watch the forecast. I do the same thing, but just keep that in mind. Get rid of the volunteer. Plant just as late as agronomically feasible for your area, and that will help mitigate a lot of our insect pests and diseases in wheat.
I don't think encouraging late planting is going to be a problem this year at all in terms of some of the precipitation. There hasn't been much as of late, and I don't know that there's much on the radar ahead either, but definitely a good reminder to control that volunteer wheat now, and it'll give you plenty of time for that late planting to get rid of all these pests in the in-between.
Well, and that's one of the problems we've had traditionally. You get rid of the volunteer too early, you get another rain, you can't plant, and you get another flush of volunteer. Mm-hmm. So you have to spray 2 or 3 times. So, it's the life of a wheat grower in Kansas. It's just the way it is. But if you can get rid of that volunteer at least 2 weeks before your planted crop germinates, you'll be heads up as far as pests and pathogens go. And like you said, it doesn't look to me like, looking at the forecast, we're going to have a lot of moisture in the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So keep that in mind.
Absolutely. And if producers are looking for more information on wheat pests or volunteer wheat management techniques, where can they find that information at?
We also have our KSU wheat insect management guides that are available through any extension office, or you can download them for free, or the Crop Insect Pests of Kansas should be coming out before long, the 2nd edition.
Excellent. Well, those will be linked in the show notes of today's program, as always. But, Jeff, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, my pleasure. Anytime, Samantha.
Absolutely. And we always are hoping for rain, but hopefully producers will get timely rains in order to get some wheat in the ground here soon.
Yes, that will help more than anything.
Absolutely. Once again, that was Jeff Whitworth. He is our K-State field crop entomologist, sharing information regarding wheat planting and volunteer control considerations to avoid pests this fall. As always, if you are on the go and listening to us on the radio with one of our radio station partners, and you're wanting to listen to more from Agriculture Today, be sure to check out our podcast. We are available as a podcast anywhere podcasts can be found. Simply search for Agriculture Today, and you should find us there. So that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, once again, anywhere podcasts can be found. And that's also where the show notes for today's program can also be found, with all of the available links that are discussed during today's programming. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. Winter may still be several months away, but homeowners with young, thin-bark trees should already be thinking about ways to protect them from sunscald. K-State horticulturist Ward Upham says that the bark on these trees can reach relatively high temperatures on warm, sunny winter days. Ward, one of the things we need to do with those thin bark trees is really protect them from the sun.
That's right, and not really now. It's protection in early spring. Doesn't mean we don't do anything now. It just means that's when that protection really does some good on those trees.
So what happens? There's some sort of a scald that takes place?
Yeah, so what happens is in late winter, you'll get that sun hitting those thin bark trees, and it'll heat up that side of the tree. And so this is going to be on the south or southwest side of the tree. And that bark can actually get up to 40 degrees warmer than the other side of the tree. And what that does is that part of the tree loses its winter hardiness. And then when you get that sharp drop in temperature at night, it actually kills that part of the bark. And so you get a long strip of bark that is dead on the south-southwest part of the tree. And it depends on what species of tree you have. The ones that are most likely to get this are things like honey locusts, fruit trees, ashes, oaks, maples, lindens, and willows. And these are young trees. Fruit trees may be a little more mature they have to protect, but on most of these, it's going to be young trees where that bark hasn't furrowed yet, where it's still thin, and then you can get this damage.
So we will see some symptoms before we get into really heavy damage?
You will, in the sense that at first you don't see anything in the spring, And then as that bark starts to grow, you'll see that bark start to crack on that south-southwest side. And then eventually it's going to fall off. And what you'll get is that dead area right on that part of the trunk. And over time, you're going to see callus tissue form on both sides and start to roll over that dead area and eventually completely cover it up. But what we want to do is prevent that from happening in the first place.
So these then will recover, is that what you're saying?
If it's an otherwise healthy tree, yes. So if it's an otherwise healthy tree, this is something they'll recover from because it's not that much damage all the way around the trunk. If you get damage all the way around the trunk, you've lost the tree. But since it's on one side, that tree can recover.
You mentioned there's some things that we can do, so what can we do?
So there's a number of different things that you can do. What you're trying to do is shade that bark. And so some people will use a tree wrap and go around that trunk and protect it from the sun hitting it directly. Another thing you can do is use something like a plastic mesh, often used to keep rabbits off, but it also is going to shade that bark enough so you don't get that type of damage. And the last thing you can do if you have a lot of trees is actually use a paint. And it has to be a latex paint, and you mix it 9 parts water to 1 part paint. You don't want to use full strength. So it's a 10% latex paint concoction. And you're going to paint that trunk up to where those branches start to form. And so you could only paint the south or southwest side, but that doesn't look very good. So people will paint the whole trunk.
So you're looking at something then that is not only, I guess, protective, but also reflective?
Yeah, so it's going to reflect that light so that it doesn't absorb, that dark bark doesn't absorb it. And so that's enough reflection that you won't get any damage to that trunk.
Is there a time then when these trees age enough that they're really not susceptible to this?
That's right. And so as that bark starts to furrow, you're going to be okay. And so you don't have to do this for the life of the tree. It's just on young trees you have to do this.
And I guess the easiest way to prevent this is to go with the mesh?
Yeah, that or the wrap. Wrap is really pretty quick, too. I mean, if you have just a few trees, you get into the paint if you have a whole bunch of trees that you need to do, and then that's probably the best way to go. The other thing to keep in mind is if you do get that damage, do not cover that damage with a tar-based product because that's going to slow the healing. What you want is that callus tissue to roll over that smooth bark that's been uncovered. And so if you have something like a tar-based product on there, it slows it down. And so don't do anything to it. I mean, you can put the white paint on it, but don't put anything else on it. It's got to be fine. It will cover.
That's K-State horticulturist Ward Upham with information on preventing sunscald on thin bark trees this winter. To learn more, check out the September 20th horticulture newsletter at hnr.k-state.edu. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.